And the idea is that those local customs and local religious practices are more flexible, are going to be easier to change and move closer to Western norms. So Uthman bin Yahya is secretly paid by Snukar Grania, and what Uthman bin Yahya does is he gives fatwas which say all Muslims are obliged to follow the European colonial government. But this particular group was shut down. So this organization that he ran, which is Front Pembela Islam, this was shut down in 2020 on charges of kind of radicalism. So they said that his arrow is now known as Kalimat al-Shahada, so the Islamic profession of faith, the Shahada. And when the arrow goes into someone's chest, it means that the Shahada is entering into their chest.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome everybody to the Project Ihya podcast. Inshallah, today we're going to be continuing our series with Dr. Aria Nakissa on the global transformation in Islamic education. And inshallah, today's episode, we're going to be discussing the transformation in Islamic education as it pertains to Southeast Asia, and inshallah, probably touching upon China as well in this session. And just a brief introduction to Dr. Aria Nakissa. Dr. Aria is a lecturer in the Faculty of Islamic Studies and the Faculty of Social Sciences in the International Islamic University, Indonesia. He has a joint PhD in anthropology and Middle Eastern studies from Harvard and a JD from Harvard Law. And he also has an MA in Islamic law from the International Islamic University of Malaysia. Inshallah, without further ado, I'll ask Dr. Aria Nakissa to, inshallah, go ahead and get the presentation started. Looking forward to it, inshallah.
Okay, well, thank you for the very kind introduction, and I'm happy to continue on. So this, I think, is going to be our last episode, but I think it will be a good one, and maybe give people information on Islam and Islamic education in certain parts of the world that many of them are less familiar with, but are quite interesting nonetheless. So let me go ahead and click on this presentation to get it up. I'm clicking on it. Is there? Okay, yeah, here we go. Yeah, so our topic today is, as you can see from the screen, Islamic education in Southeast Asia and China. We'll be focusing mostly on Southeast Asia. We'll also give a little bit of attention to China as well. So let's begin with Southeast Asia. So, if we're talking about Islam in Southeast Asia today, there are a number of Muslim countries in Southeast Asia where Muslims are the majority. There's Indonesia, which is the most important country just simply because it has a very large Muslim population. It's maybe around 80-90%, maybe around 90% Muslim. Then you have Malaysia, and then you also have Brunei. So these are three Muslim majority countries in Southeast Asia. And in fact, Indonesia has the largest population of any contemporary Muslim majority country. Moreover, in Southeast Asia, you have a number of countries that have minority populations, Muslim minorities. There's the Philippines, where Muslims live in kind of the southern area. There's also Thailand, where Muslims live in the southern part of Thailand, kind of close to the border with Malaysia. And then you also have a Muslim minority in Singapore. But in terms of discussing Islam in Southeast Asia, I will say some things that pertain to the region generally, but I'm going to give special attention to Indonesia and Malaysia because these are the two most influential and important Muslim majority countries in the region. Okay, so before we start talking about what Islamic education in this region looks like today, it is helpful to begin with some history of this region. So, for over 2,000 years, there have been Indian Ocean trade routes. So, these are trade routes that people use to travel along the Indian Ocean to a number of different countries connected with the Indian Ocean. In the West, these Indian Ocean trade routes go up to the Arabian Peninsula and East Africa. So they go from the Arabian Peninsula and East Africa in the West, then they go to India, then they go through Southeast Asia, and they go to China. So traders, merchants, religious scholars, holy men have for thousands of years crossed back and forth through these trade routes. And since these trade routes go back at least 2,000 years, they go back before the emergence of Islam. So initially, many of the people who use these trade routes, because these trade routes go through India, and they go through India and they continue on to Southeast Asia. So, as many of you are probably aware, the Hindu and Buddhist traditions emerged in an Indian context, and you had merchants and religious scholars from India travel along these trade routes, and then they brought their religious traditions to Southeast Asia. Um, and so that means you have a situation where, roughly 2,000 years ago, you have Hinduism and you have Hindu and Buddhist traditions come to Southeast Asia. They're taken to Southeast Asia, and they begin blending with the local animistic religious practices to generate a kind of local Hindu-Buddhist syncretism. Then, around the 13th century, you have Muslims expanding their empires. Not only they're expanding their empires in the northern portion of South Asia, but around the 13th century, Muslim missionaries are able to establish their religion in Southeast Asia. So they are, by this time, you have by the 13th century, you have Muslim traders, you have Muslim scholars, and they are also using these Indian Ocean trade routes. So they go ahead and they bring their understanding of Islam to a Southeast Asian context. And in this Southeast Asian context, their understanding of Islam, their teachings of Islam, come to be mixed together with the previously existing Hindu, Buddhist, and local syncretic or local animist traditions. Um, uh, Often you have a number of missionaries, often Sufi missionaries that are kind of playing a leading role in bringing Islam to Southeast Asia. And perhaps the most famous of these missionaries are known as the Nine Saints, or Wali Sango. So the Wali Sango are traditionally believed to have been of foreign descent, or perhaps more particularly Middle Eastern descent. They're believed to be scholars from the Middle Eastern area who, over the course of the 15th and the 16th century, came to Southeast Asia's most important island, which is the island of Java. The island of Java is not only the most important island in Southeast Asia, it's also the most important island in Indonesia. So between the 15th and the 16th centuries, these nine saints, these Wali Sango, bring Islam to a Southeast Asian context, in particular the island of Java. And one of the things that these saints are known for doing is they are known for propagating a form of Islam that is integrated with the pre-existing Hindu, Buddhist, animist religious traditions. So the most famous example of this is the use of shadow puppet shows to convey Islamic teachings. So you have a situation where, prior to the coming of Islam, individuals are communicating stories. They're telling Hindu stories, especially the Hindu epics, Mahabharata and Ramayana. But what happens is these missionaries, these Islamic missionaries known as the Nine Saints or the Wali Sango, they say we are going to use, so prior to them coming, prior to these Muslim saints coming, not only do you have Indonesians and other Southeast Asians kind of they use shadow puppet shows to uh, reenact or teach the stories of Ramayana and Mahabharata. They do this while they are playing gamelan musical instruments. So these are kind of metallic sounding instruments. They sound a little bit like a xylophone. Um, and what happened was these Muslim saints, or these Muslim missionaries, the Nine Saints, said, okay, the way that we're going to teach Islam is we are going to put on our own puppet shows. So we're going to continue on putting the puppet shows, and we're going to continue teaching Ramayana and Mahabharata, but we're going to mix in Islamic teachings and Islamic symbols. So one of the things that they would do is they would, in the Mahabharata, there is a famous warrior, a famous archer, Hindu archer. His name is Arjuna. And if I remember correctly, they take one of his and he shoots arrows to kill his enemies. And then the Nine Saints reportedly altered this. So they said that his arrow is now known as Kalimat Shahada. So the Islamic profession of faith is Shahada. And when the arrow goes into someone's chest, it means that the Shahada is entering into their chest. So this would be an example. Also, one of these missionaries named Sunan Kalijaga was apparently an excellent puppeteer, and he would agree to perform these puppet shows for audiences on the condition that they would recite the Shahada themselves. So those are some examples of the mixing of Islamic teachings with pre-Islamic Hindu Buddhist teachings. Another example is prior to the coming of Islam, one of the local traditions, kind of a local Javanese tradition, not that is mixed with Hinduism and Buddhism, but which presumably existed before the coming of Hindu Buddhism, or at least maintained some level of distinctness. One very important religious practice was a type of ritual feast known as a slamatan. So Southeast Asians, when they celebrate, especially in Indonesia, when there were important events in their life, like birth, marriage, death, harvest, or there were illnesses, or opening up a new business, whenever there was some kind of event that they wanted to go well, something important happened in their life and they wanted it to go well, they would hold these ritual feasts where they would, for instance, invite people to a feast with different types of foods, especially rice. And what initially, before the coming of Islam, these feasts were believed to offer some sort of protection from evil spirits and bad fortune. But Muslim missionaries continued performing these feasts, continued performing these ritual feasts, but they altered them in a variety of ways. So, for instance, one of the ways that they would alter these feasts is in the feasts, they would begin to chant the Quran and Arabic Islamic prayers. These were integrated into these ritual feasts. And on top of that, part of the food from the feast was given to the poor as alms. So this would be an example of how you have some pre-existing religious practices like this Slamatan ritual feast. It's not completely eliminated altogether. Rather, it is modified um, to incorporate certain Islamic values. So those are just some examples. Um, By the 13th century, you have the development of relatively small Muslim kingdoms or sultanates. These kingdoms begin to emerge throughout Southeast Asia. Some of the most famous are in Aceh and Malacca, but you have others in Brunei, Sulu, Banten. However, religious life in one of the factors that shapes pre-modern religious life or Islamic religious life in Southeast Asia is that compared to other regions, Southeast Asia is comparatively poor and has a low population density. So, for instance, if you were to compare it to South Asia, if you were to compare it to the Middle East, if you were to compare it to Central Asia, it's not as resource rich. One of the reasons is because you don't have a lot of agricultural land. You don't have a lot of agricultural land. You don't have a lot of fresh water resources to go ahead and provide to water agricultural land. I mean, the one of the big exceptions or big partial exceptions is the island of Java, which is why Java becomes kind of like a hub of culture. But generally speaking, you don't have a lot of rich agricultural land. And if you don't have a lot of agricultural land, can't support a large population and it doesn't yield a lot of tax revenue. So that means that there are limited financial resources to invest in scholarship, to invest in paying Islamic scholars to learn and to teach. You have a limited amount of money also for building mosques and madrasas. So this situation is a little bit similar in some ways to that which we find in pre-modern sub-Saharan Africa. And for that reason, Southeast Asia, like sub-Saharan Africa, is kind of a more peripheral region of the Muslim world. And in fact, in much of Southeast Asia, the resources are so limited that there are no madrasas in many parts of Southeast Asia up until the 20th century. So examples would be in Kalimantan and in Sulawesi. These are kind of important islands in contemporary Indonesia and Malaysia. Before the 20th century, these areas do not have madrasas. Even those regions within Southeast Asia that are known for Islamic learning, there were no madrasas, there were no real madrasas in these areas before the 18th century. So, two areas in Southeast Asia that are kind of the most known for Islamic learning would be Sumatra, and the northern part of Sumatra is as Aceh, and then Java. So these are kind of the two areas in Southeast Asia where Islamic learning is the most advanced, but they don't have madrasas before the 18th century. Wherever, to the extent that they did develop these madrasas did not have a particularly high status. And the reason is because they were relatively small. They had a small number of students. They had limited financial resources. And whenever you have a madrasa that has limited financial resources, it means you can't, pay teachers a lot of money. You can't pay to have a lot of different teachers and a lot of different books or fields of knowledge taught there. So, for that reason, you had, comparatively speaking, very few high ranking or well educated religious scholars in Southeast Asia. So, we can say that the madrasas, which did eventually develop in Southeast Asia, maybe in 18th and 19th century, they taught more basic subjects. They taught, basic fiqh, basic theology, basic elements of Sufism. But students who wanted to pursue higher levels of religious learning, so very advanced forms of religious learning, they had to leave the region. And the area that they usually went to was like people from many other regions in the Muslim world, they often traveled to the Middle East. So The two most important centers of learning that they would travel to was one was Cairo's Al Azhar Mosque and one was Mecca's Al Masjid Al Haram. Um, so you have a lot of, as we will see, you have a lot of scholars in a Southeast Asian context. They're very much influenced by both of these hubs of learning, although more Cairo's Al Azhar, and that is because Mecca's the type of Islam that is found in a Southeast Asian context is like a Shafi type Islam, kind of Shafi in terms of legal school, Ashari in terms of Aqidah, and then kind of like a traditionalist, a Sufi orientation. That form of Islam is taught at Al Masjid Al Haram into the early 20th century. But around the early 20th century, it declines because in the 1920s, as you might recall, Mecca is annexed. So initially, it is run by the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire kind of supports and sponsors kind of a traditional, Shafi, Asharite, Sufi form of Islam. But in the 1920s, you have the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the annexation of the Hijaz into the modern state of Saudi Arabia. And the modern state of Saudi Arabia has kind of more like a Wahhabi, Salafi orientation. And when this happens, many of the Indonesian students who are previously going to Al Masjid Al Haram, they start focusing to a greater extent on getting higher religious education from Cairo's Al Azhar. At any rate, the fact that you don't have strong madrasa education in Southeast Asia means that you don't. This contributes to the fact that the type of Islam found in this region is, comparatively speaking, less bound to scriptural texts, less bound to kind of scholarly textual modes of Islam, and more bound to local forms of living, evolving, syncretic religious practice. Um, so that is part of the background that we should keep in mind when we're thinking about the development of Islamic education in Southeast Asia. Another important thing that we should keep in mind is European colonialism. So different European powers begin colonizing Southeast Asia in the 16th and the 17th centuries. And for our purposes, Dutch and British colonialism are particularly important. So, between the 19th and mid 20th centuries, the Dutch and British Empire established control of what is presently known as Indonesia and Malaysia. So, basically, between the 19th and 20th centuries, the Dutch have established control over all of what we know right now as Indonesia, and the British have established control over all of Malaysia, which at that time is sometimes referred to as Malaya. And as in other regions, these European colonial empires have a particular political project. It is a liberal political project of bringing progress. Progress is understood, as we've talked about in previous sessions. Progress is a matter of when you bring civilizational progress to a region, what that means is bringing scientific knowledge, forms of technological and economic growth that are tied to scientific knowledge. It also means bringing certain liberal values associated with freedom and equality that today we would speak in terms of human rights. So, as I've said, as I've explained in previous episodes, when I talk about civilizational progress, I mean what you would today call modernization or international development. You can think of it as this spread of kind of like a scientific worldview and also evolving liberal human rights norms. So basically, the Dutch and the British empires want to bring this to their colonial possessions in Southeast Asia, just as they're bringing them to their colonial possessions in South Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa. And as
So what does
another,
that actually
hmm?
look like, Dr. Arya? What does that actually look like, on the ground, like, 17th century or, 19th century? Um, on the ground, what does that look like? What kind of reforms are they doing? Is it more legal in nature? Is it more political? Is there throwing going on? Is there propaganda? Like, what does that actually look like?
Oh, well, you can. So there are a number of different ways these changes are implemented. So, one of the most basic changes is a gradual change in the legal system. So, you have the idea that certain parts of the legal system, which are not liberal or European in character, need to be phased out, including Islamic elements of a legal system. So there is the notion that, for instance, Islamic laws of war or jihad would not apply. So, for instance, there would be no idea of jihad against non Muslim regimes or slavery or these other types of practices. So, one is the military rules are removed, the political rules are removed, the criminal law is removed, the commercial law, so for instance, no, riba loans, or no kind of interest transactions, this would be removed. And in terms of Islam, to the extent that Islamic law is applied, it is limited to family courts. So it is limited to family courts, and is limited to religious rituals. But the idea is that Sharia in society should not be applied beyond the realm of religious rituals like Hajj and prayer and fasting, and then family law courts. However, I should make one further note. The European, so the British and the Dutch will say, okay, we are going to preserve the indigenous religious traditions when it comes to family law. But their understanding of family law is that in a Southeast Asian context, like some other contexts, but particularly in a Southeast Asian context, the idea is that the indigenous religious tradition of Southeast Asian Muslims is not purely based on Islamic law. So even their family law is not pure Islamic law. Rather, it is partially Islamic law and partially local custom known as adat. And in fact, this is the same whether we're talking about Southeast Asians or Berbers or sub-Saharan African populations. The idea is that in certain cases they have amended their family law. So to give you, although this varies by ethnicity, so let me give you a famous example. There is a group of Muslim people on the island of Sumatra. There's an Muslim ethnicity. They're known as the Minangkabau. And what they are famous for is having a matrilineal inheritance customs. That means that, for instance, if there's a house, it is the daughters that inherit all that. The sons don't inherit any of that. So the idea would be when the British talk, or when the Dutch talk about preserving or respecting the law of the Minangkabau, they recognize that certain elements of Minangkabau law come from Islam, come from the Sharia. So maybe the rule of three talaqs comes from the Sharia. But other elements of their law, let's say, for instance, the inheritance law, comes from local custom. So even then, to the extent that they are saying that there is a space, that family law is one area where you could apply some element of Islamic law, it would really be a mixture of Islamic law and local custom. But at any rate, everything outside of this sphere of rituals and family law is phased out, and what you get instead is like a Dutch or a British legal system. And the
So,
Dutch
and how do they like manage to penetrate? this deep. Like when we're talking about South Asia, then we actually see that they come initially as traders, and then you have like the incoming mercenaries that aided those traders, right? Uh, the company, and then eventually, like much later, you get actual government involvement. What does it look like in the Javanese regions?
Yeah, so initially it is the Dutch East Indies Company. What they do is they initially establish I believe it's around 1600. I mean, don't quote me on the dates, but I think it's around 1600. They establish a settlement in Jakarta, which at that time is known as Batavia. And then, but this is a corporation that is working with the Dutch government as well, and they have arms to kind of defend themselves. And then gradually they expand more and more, so they expand from the city of Batavia. They expand across the entire island of Java, and then they start taking on these other islands. Indonesia actually has 17,000 islands, so they move from island to island, taking it over kind of decade by decade. They are expanding out, and then there's progressively more government oversight, especially when you start talking about the 19th century. So maybe in the context of Britain, before 1850, you have kind of the British East India Company. But then after the Sepoy Rebellion, around 1850, then you have kind of the British government exercising more direct control. There's a similar evolution in Indonesia, although it happens a little bit later, closer to the end of the 19th century, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, so one of the changes would be you change the laws, and of course the laws you're bringing in are laws that are understood as being more consistent with human rights. Also, you are establishing schools. One of the important things is to establish schools throughout the region, especially to educate the children of elites. And what you're teaching in those schools would be Western forms of knowledge and morality. So kind of scientific. So, okay, we're going to establish courses on mathematics and biology and history and the English language or the Dutch language, and also in these different classes, we're going to inculcate different forms of Western morality, kind of when we're teaching classes on politics and government and history. So education and legal reform are two of the major ways in which liberalization happens, but there are other things as well. So you have the establishment of presses and a print culture where people are printing books and newspapers that, in terms of content, spread kind of notions, kind of spread Western forms of knowledge and Western opinions. And then in addition to that, you also have a situation where both the British and the Dutch establish relationships with religious scholars, and they have these religious scholars. They promote and to some extent fund religious scholars who are seen as being open to progress. So people who are willing to go ahead and preach a form of Islam that has kind of a mixture of traditional Islamic norms and then kind of the Western liberal norms that are associated with civilizational progress. So in a Southeast Asian context, you have certain figures like Syed Sheikh Al Hadi would be a good example of a figure of this type, like a kind of a pro-British Malay scholar, and before him Munshi Abdullah. Okay, so
Can you elaborate a little on their backgrounds? You mentioned Sayyid Sheikh al Hadith, and you also mentioned Munshi Abdullah. Can you elaborate a little bit more on their backgrounds and like what does the phenomenon actually look like? Like, I mean, this is something that we've discussed before as well when it comes to the context of the Middle East and Egypt, right? We have certain figures
Mm-hmm.
there as well that kind of part of the Islamic religious scholarship. And I think one thing that we can say is that colonizers were very aware of how Islamic civilizations worked in general, as opposed to, for example, like
Mm-hmm.
other Aboriginal communities where they might not necessarily actually have to, kind of seep into the theological. They realize with Muslim communities that, Muslim communities do rely on their scholars, and having their legitimization, means a lot for them. So, how do we see this phenomenon taking place, and like what was the trajectory of someone like Munshi Abdullah, or anyone else that was pro British?
Okay, let me go ahead and check. Okay, so one of the figures, so I'll give you an example of one figure who is kind of like a famous figure. He is an Indonesian figure. His name is Uthman bin Yahya. And he worked he worked for the Dutch government. He lived from 1822 to 1913. He was the Grand Mufti of Jakarta. He worked for the Dutch government. In particular, he worked for a very famous Orientalist, maybe the most famous Orientalist of the late 19th, early 20th century, an individual named Christian Snukurgrania. So Christian Snukurgrania was, on the one hand, a scholar of Islam, a very respected and knowledgeable scholar of Islam. One of his first books was a description of the Hajj. So he went to Mecca. He basically, he was a spy. He pretended that he was a Muslim. He went to Mecca. He wrote an account of the Hajj in Mecca, but he also wrote about a group of Indonesians who was living in Mecca. Remember that I said that, especially before the 1920s, you have a situation where many Indonesians or many Southeast Asians are they're spending time in Mecca as a center of learning. So Christian Snukurgrania writes a book about them, writes a book about the Muslim Hajj practices and the Indonesian community that is in Mecca. One of the reasons why the Indonesian and a lot of his work will be sponsored by the Indonesia, or will be sponsored by the Dutch colonial government. The Dutch colonial government is concerned. They want to know about Indonesia. They want to know about Hajj because they see Hajj as a potential source of fanaticism. They say that, okay, Indonesians have a syncretic form of Islam. They have limited communication with other Muslims in other parts of the world. But when they go on Hajj, they learn more about a traditional, maybe more scripturalist form of Islam. They take back norms, they take back ideas about shared Muslim identity, and that inspires within them a type of political radicalism which makes them want to oppose the Dutch and, in fact, cooperate across ethnic lines, across racial lines with other Muslims to oppose the Dutch and to oppose colonial governments more generally. So they're very worried, and I mean they're responding to a real phenomenon. It's not like it's not like the Indonesians who go on Hajj come back and then they become political activists. But what they do is they do absorb a more standard, global, scripturally oriented form of Islam as opposed to a more local, syncretic form of Islam. And they begin propagating this when they get back to Indonesia. This is a very common phenomenon. They will go on Hajj. They will say, okay, I got more religious knowledge. Now I'm going to come back and I'm going to go ahead and spread the correct understanding of Islam that I've learned in Mecca, which is which is based on Quran, which is based on Hadith, which is based on these maybe Shafi fiqh texts that I wasn't so aware of before. And I'm going to go ahead and oppose local customs when they conflict with this. So maybe I'm not going to agree with using Hindu puppet shows to teach Islam. Maybe I'm going to do something like encourage men to wear beards and encourage women to wear veils. Maybe I'm going to do something like oppose matrilineal inheritance. Like if I'm among the Minangkabau, I'm going to oppose matrilineal inheritance practices. So the part of the Dutch colonial project was sealing the Indonesians off from the rest of the Muslim world. And the idea was that we cannot allow Indonesian Islam basically has these two components to it. One is a living local culture, and one is it's mixed with kind of like a scripturally oriented, more fixed form of Islam. And they said, we're worried that Indonesian Islam will develop in a way where the kind of local living culture dies away, and it will become a type of fundamentalism, which is really kind of linked to fixed scriptural texts or linked to standard traditions, kind of standard teachings that you find among Shafis or Asherites or something else. And they preferred colonial empires generally, whether we're talking about the Dutch, whether we're talking about the French, they prefer a type of Islam that is mixed with local culture, because they say local culture is something that is easier to change. It is something that we can more easily change over time. And we can gradually modify the local culture such that it is more consistent with our liberal norms. However, what we found is when Muslims base their religious understanding not on unwritten local cultural norms transmitted through practice, but rather on fixed scriptural texts, then it becomes more immutable. It becomes more difficult to change. So, for instance, to give you an example from a French context, the French in North Africa thought that the Berbers would be more easy to civilize than the Arabs. And civilize for them means get them to adopt civilizational progress. Why? Because the Arabs spoke the Arabic language, and their form of religiosity was seen as rooted in this tradition of scripture and authoritative fiqh texts based on scripture. Meanwhile, if you are talking about Berbers or if you're talking about sub-Saharan Africans, the idea is that their version of Islam is more based on, to some extent, it's based on these scriptural texts, but to a greater extent, it's based on local customs, local religious customs and religious practices. And the idea is that those local customs and local religious practices are going to be are more flexible, are going to be easier to change and move closer to Western norms. So there's this idea that it is going to be more easy to, let's say, civilize the Berbers than with respect to the Arabs. And in Indonesia, they're thinking they have a similar approach. They're thinking as long as Indonesians or Southeast Asians have a form of Islam which is shaped by this local living culture, they're going to be more flexible. They're going to be more open to progress. However, if it is linked to these texts, then their religious teachings or their religious understanding is going to be more fixed and more difficult to reform. So Snoek Hergrania is monitoring this. Snoek Hergrania also moves to Indonesia after he's conducted his study in Mecca, and he starts running kind of like a ministry that deals with Muslim affairs. And one of his goals is to reform Islam. And he writes about this in his books. He says, there are certain Islamic teachings that are problematic. Teachings on government and jihad are particularly problematic because based on these teachings, it basically justifies It encourages Indonesian people to believe that it is not correct for them to be ruled by non-Muslims, and it encourages them to
So
rebel in the name of jihad against non-Muslims. So Snooker Grania will say things like, we cannot allow them to teach these kind of things in pesantrens. And moreover, he will cooperate with local scholars like the scholar that I mentioned earlier, Uthman bin Yahya. So Uthman bin Yahya is secretly paid by Snooker Grania. And what Uthman bin Yahya does is he gives fatwas which say all Muslims are obliged to follow the European colonial government. This is what our religion teaches us. That's not illegitimate because he's countering other Indonesian scholars. So there are Indonesian scholars, some of them are in Java, some of them are in Aceh, and they're saying, oh, based on our religion says that it is haram for us to be ruled by non-Muslims who are imposing a non-Islamic form of law, and in fact, it is justified to have a jihad rebellion. And in fact, there are these rebellions. So there are these rebellions in the mid to late 19th century and before, especially in Aceh. There are these rebellions against the Dutch. And in fact, well, this is one of Snooker Grania's major goals, is to prevent these rebellions. So one of the things he does is he says, Islam needs to be adjusted to get rid of these doctrines on governance, doctrines on jihad, such that Muslims can accept kind of being ruled by the Dutch. So this would be one example of how religious authorities are paid to go ahead and modify their message. This is very famous in other contexts as well. So in South Asia, there's a reason why the British promote Syed Ahmed Khan or Amir Ali. These are individuals who preach that Islam is consistent, that Islam legitimates the rule of the British. Or if we were talking about sub-Saharan Africa, we could talk about figures like Senegalese figures like El Hajj Malik Sai. This is kind of one of their major, or Amadou Bamba. These are one of their major teachings, is that Islam accepts Islam accepts secular governments which impose Western legislation. It is legitimate to obey them. It is, in fact, obligatory to obey them. And to be a Muslim, it's sufficient just to have Islamic rituals and Islamic family law.
So what interests me, I guess, is that would you say that it's a consistent trend, across that these, people that work with the colonial administrators, at least in the Indonesian region, and maybe across the board, maybe in sub-Saharan Africa as well as South Asia, as well as maybe in Egypt, that they're all paid, and then do we have like evidence of that?
Yeah, we literally have evidence. Yeah, like literally, yeah, is an employee. He does literally receive money.
And Sir
Um,
Syed Ahmed as well
um,
in South Asia.
he was an employee. He was an employee of the British government. I mean, this literally an employee. Amir Ali is literally an employee of
Okay.
the government. Um, So, I mean, this giving people money isn't the only way to get them to adopt a certain reformed perspective. Another is this: okay, if you don't adopt a reformed perspective, you're going to be jailed. How does that sound? Like, we're just going to shut down your school, we're going to shut down your mosque. That's like another. So, you can use the carrot or you can use the stick. The carrot is funding, and the stick is the threat of having your ability to teach or preach restricted. So this is the kind of thing that the Muslims of this era in these contexts face, and all of them come to accept similar conceptions of Islam, or at least there's a great deal of pressure to accept one of two
Yeah,
conceptions of
and to
Islam.
be honest, I mean, this is a further tangent that I'm not gonna go on for too long, but I do want to add the comment that this is not a practice that is unseen now, right? It's not something that is uh, completely like non-present in today's time, right? Like the characters or the stick, as you mentioned it, and the kind of like, let's say, modernization or bringing progress to traditional Muslims in modern day settings, like in today's modern day settings, whether it's by the threat of shutting down schools, or the threat of removing their, let's say, nonprofit status, or at the same time, it could just be something as simple as being on a payroll or receiving grants, funding, and so on and so forth. So it seems like it's not really just a simply, let's say, colonial or old practice, as we would say, but perhaps there's like a neo-colonial, representation of that as well.
Yeah, I mean, in almost all Muslim countries, the religious establishment is dominated by state institutions. So there are state run religious universities. That is true whether we talk about Indonesia or Malaysia or Pakistan, or I mean, maybe Pakistan somewhat less because they have like a lot of the smaller Deobandi Darul Ulooms. But Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, um, these are countries where the mosques and the religious universities are predominantly run by the state. And if you are working for one of those institutions, you are expected to teach a version of Islam that is approved by the state. And generally speaking, whether we're talking about a colonial government, so sometimes people think that the colonial government sought to eliminate the Islamic infrastructure, that they sought to eliminate Islamic schools, that they sought to eliminate Islamic mosques. In certain cases, they did. But the far more common practice was simply to use them as effective mechanisms for reforming religion in these countries. And what they would say to Muslims at that time, so what the British and the French and the Dutch said, I mean, it depended on what country they were talking about. They basically said that there are two forms of Islam that we accept. So, number one is Islam is essentially about aqidah and rituals and family law. And anything beyond that is seen as a type, as a problematic, as a type of fanaticism or extremism. And if you are a religious scholar that preaches, oh, we need to impose Islamic criminal law or commercial law or politics, you get into trouble. You get into problems. And not only you're not going to get a job, but you could be put in jail. You could be deported. Like many of the people, I mean, the British and the Dutch are doing things like they're deporting people from, like they deport Amadou Bamba when they think that he's more of a radical person. They deported Imam Bonjol from Southeast Asia. I mean, they often will deport you or arrest you if you're seen as having what they will think of as a political understanding of Islam. A political understanding of Islam is one that extends beyond the realm of aqidah and rituals and family law. So some of them will say, yeah, this is a form of Islam that we accept. And usually the way that Muslim scholars will justify this is they will justify it in one of two ways. You have the Muhammad Abdul Rashid Rida school of justification, which is everything beyond aqidah and family law and ritual law is a area of ijtihad, and we can remove all of those laws. We can change all of those laws. We can replace all of those laws with laws that are more suited to producing maslaha under our modern conditions. In the name of maslaha or maqasid al-sharia. That's one school. The other is like the pragmatic school, which is that, look, okay, in an ideal situation, in an ideal world, we should call for the full implementation of Sharia. But we're not in that position right now. And because we're not in that position right now, we should not call for full implementation of the Sharia. So why wouldn't we call for it now? One idea is that the Sharia is only applicable in a society where there are ideal social circumstances. So for instance, we cannot apply the hudud unless we've removed poverty first. Or we cannot apply the blasphemy punishment until the entire society has received like a deep Islamic education. only at some point in the distant future, 50 years, 100 years from now, would it be possible to apply full Sharia. So for that reason, we don't need to really worry about anything beyond family law. Another view is just, look, we cannot preach implementation of Sharia beyond the realm of family law because that would cause the government to repress us. So for that reason, we shouldn't talk about that as well. So you might ask someone who many of the scholars, the more traditionalist scholars, have this kind of perspective. We wanted to talk about someone who had this perspective more recently. A good example would be Muhammad Said Ramadan al-Bouti. So Muhammad Said Ramadan al-Bouti, if you ask him, do you believe in applying like the full Sharia? He would say, yeah, of course, but not in the distant future, in a situation where the population is educated, in a situation where they're ready for it, in a situation where there's not poverty and they have a sufficient amount of Islamic knowledge, then yeah, in that distant future we'll allow it, but it's not productive to talk about that right now. For practical purposes right now, we should focus on talking about aqidah, aqidah and rituals and maybe family law. This type, once again, I'm not saying this to criticize this perspective, but it is common. I mean, the most formal, like some examples of how this approach is formalized might be like Tablighi Jamaat, where they say we're going to avoid political matters, not because they don't believe that the Sharia doesn't apply to politics, but they say as a pragmatic standpoint, it's something that we should avoid
Okay,
talking
so
about.
I want to
It's
kind of
counterproductive.
pick your brain on this, and let's see if we can create some dichotomies here, right? So, on one end, you have, for example, people that are actual political actors that are being apolitical, right? Like, I mean, obviously, there's no such thing as being apolitical. Silence is also politics, right? But there's a kind of, you can say, volitional, intentional component to it, which is basically that there are colonial powers, and this could go one of two ways, right? Either that it's because they're colluding with colonial administrators and they don't want to have any kind of disruption, right? So they're working with them. The other could be that they just feel so cognitively and mentally subjugated that they see that as an actual practical step for the survival of Muslims, right? Like maybe it's nothing like pernicious or malicious. That's a second category, we could say. And then you could have like people that have nothing to do with colonization, and I really wonder, like for example, a figure like Sheikh Saeed Ramadan al-Bouti, if he's actually just speaking from a pragmatic standpoint, or is there some kind of like political motive to it, right? But it could be something that's just like innocuous and kind of like, okay, what is um, let's say even from a person can actually be very political, right, in their stance or in their beliefs. They can be very political, but there's a certain strategy to that politics, and that is something like, okay, there are certain sequences to this. Like for example, certain people would make the argument that if you look at the prophetic um, you know stages, right, you have basically, like for example, the fermentation of beliefs working on iman, and then eventually you have like ahkam, you have law, and perhaps before that you have maybe a focus on akhlaq, like iman and akhlaq, maybe they happen simultaneously, then a stronger focus on ahkam, an entire legal system, and then the byproduct of that you have is like a political a system that kind of generates out of that, right? And that's not that it's reductive to the political sphere, but maybe more like that politics does matter, but there are stages to it, right? That could be like a third position. And then the fourth position could be like, if we think deeply on the Tablighi Jamaat, I really wonder if it's that we choose to be apolitical, like silent on politics, or is it that our effort simply does not discuss that? Like it's not focused on that. Yeah, on your own time, you could be involved in whatever kind of political matter you want to be involved in, but this is focused on XYZ matters.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if people, so someone might think, okay, there are people who talk about politics and they're the authentic Muslims, and then there are people who don't talk about politics, and all of them are hypocrites, or they have avoided, they're selling out or something like this. I think that this is not understanding the way that liberal power functions. What liberal power does is it creates a situation where you can have two types of people. You could have someone who sincerely in their heart really does accept a liberal conception of religion, and they're just looking for they do believe that religion should be limited to aqidah and rituals and family law. That could sincerely be their belief, that could sincerely be their desire, and maybe they're just producing any way to rationalize or justify that type of religion, which is the type of religion that the liberal state wants. Okay? So there are people like that. But what the liberal state does, so the liberal state obviously likes people of that more, feels more comfortable with those type of people. But one of the key aspects of liberal power is taking Muslims who would sincerely desire a non-liberal conception of politics, like their ideal would be an Islamic state, and then using repression to have them make a trade-off. So basically saying, okay, we know that you are sincere in wanting to, let's say, apply or adopt a form of Islam that extends into the political sphere. But what we're going to do is we are going to implement certain repressive policies that are even going to make someone like you act, for all practical purposes, as if you are someone who is restricting religion you're restricting religion to maybe politics and aqidah and family law, and you're not entering into the political sphere, because you know that if you do enter into the political sphere, there are going to be repressive repercussions. So this system is structured so that whether you are a person who believes in a liberal conception of religion that does not leak into the realm of politics, or whether you are a Muslim who would endorse a concept of religion that extends into the realm of politics, in terms of your practical behavior, there's not a big difference between them. Because even if you want religion to extend into the realm of politics, you have to face certain consequences. You have to face the prospect of repression, to the point that it becomes you're incentivized not to speak about politics because you're worried about your school being shut down, or you're worried about being arrested. This is a key aspect of colonial and post-colonial politics, and it makes it difficult to tell apart. So, for instance, myself, if it came to, let's say, Tablighi Jamaat, I wouldn't say, oh, they want to limit religion to the private sphere. They don't believe in extending religion to a realm of politics. I would simply say that power in many countries functions in such a way that whether you want to mix religion and politics, or whether you don't want to mix religion and politics, it doesn't matter, because either way, there are such penalties for mixing together religion and politics, for extending politics into the political sphere, that even if you want to do that, you say the trade-off is not worth it. If I tried to do that, my entire school, my school, my organization, and everything would be eliminated. So when I say that there are certain traditionalist scholars who limit themselves, and they only talk about aqidah, and they only talk about rituals, and they only talk about family law, it is not because I want to claim that they're not sincerely committed to, under ideal circumstances, extending beyond that realm. But part of a liberal power, part of a liberal governance, is to ensure that people like that face such strong consequences that they voluntarily limit themselves and don't speak of religion as outside of the realm that liberalism has granted it. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, yeah. I was just listening. I kind of went to praise Salah, but um, the question that Mufti was asking, well, I guess I came in kind of the middle of the discussion you were talking about uh, with regards to how liberalism sets it up in a way, sets the system in a way where it de-incentivizes, um, basically bringing your religion towards, forward into politics, or at
Yeah,
least colonial or post-colonial system. That's how it was. Would you say that that still applies nowadays in a post-colonial sense as well?
yeah.
Um,
There are different things. There are people, scholars are incentivized under liberal governance to endorse a form of religion that is limited to aqidah and rituals and family law. And if they speak beyond that, they can face formal or informal social and legal punishments, although the extent that they would face it depends on from country to country. So, for instance, in the US, I actually don't think that there are huge penalties for speaking out about those things. But that's precisely because, Muslims are what, maybe 1 or 2% of the population. So, contrary to what you might see on Fox News, of course, the idea that America is going to become a Sharia state is absurd.
right.
But if you are talking about a Muslim majority country where there is a significant portion of the population that would be inclined to actually changing the laws in an Islamic direction, in that case, there are limitations on speech and different forms of employment discrimination or different types of intimidation by security services to ensure that certain boundaries aren't crossed. And that's the case in the colonial period, and it's the case in the post-colonial for most post-colonial states as
And it's
well.
probably the case. It's beyond just politics, even like social or moral norms. Um, you find restrictions and you find hurdles if you try to bring religion to bear on those sort of angles of social life, or even the moral understanding of the society.
Yeah. So it's these when people wonder why religion is reformed, why people's understandings of religion change to move closer to accepting elements of civilizational progress or international development. It's due to these pressures. So, yeah, I mean, there are certain Muslims who genuinely and sincerely admire liberal ideals of civilizational progress. Okay, they voluntarily make some changes, but there are also Muslims who oppose this, and if they oppose it, they do face different types of repression. I mean, this isn't unique to a liberal system. The thing about liberals is maybe they're a little bit less honest about it, but any political system has certain ideals, has certain values, and uses coercive force to implement that. Now, no one would deny that if it comes to traditional Christianity or Hinduism or Islam. Sometimes people have some mistakes about liberalism and they think that it's somehow an exception. Whereas in reality, no, liberalism, like other forms of governance, does have certain coercive mechanisms to ensure compliance with its most highly valued ideals.
Yeah, I think that's an important point about liberalism. I think people think that liberalism just means that everybody can do, or um, you know, I guess shape their surroundings the way they want to. But that liberalism doesn't have anything to say about the moral or social framework or political framework of a society. But it does very much so. It does have that, and uh, it does, put pressure so that society does go in the direction that. So basically, it does have a worldview in terms of morality, in terms of all these other things.
Yeah, that's what you get from actually. So if you read kind of like um, the kind of liberal propaganda that might be taught in schools is, oh,
Yeah.
liberalism is just do whatever you want and everyone's equal. this is not. This is different from the historical policies of liberalism. So, liberalism has been a political program that's been around from 2 to 3 centuries, and um, it has been when we actually look at liberal policies, they do involve the imposition of liberal norms. I mean, that's what colonialism was. Colonialism was European military governments imposing liberal norms in the name of civilization across the world. And in fact, that didn't begin with colonialism. It began in the 1700s with what was known as enlightened absolutism, where you had
Yeah.
European dictatorial governments in places like France under after the French Revolution, or in Spain, or in Italy, or in Prussia, and you would have these figures like Friedrich the Great, or Peter the Great, or Catherine the Great, or Napoleon, and what they said is we need to go ahead and liberate our societies from the influence of tradition, especially the church, the Catholic Church, and authoritarian mechanisms were used to accomplish this. And then after everyone had internalized and agreed to these liberal values, then these authoritarian mechanisms became less necessary because it had become more consensual.
Hmm. Slow
But
creep.
it Yeah, but if the population were to reject liberal values, the state would step in. I mean, people are not allowed to violate human rights. They're not allowed to violate the Constitution, even if they do it with a democratic vote. This is something the army or the judiciary would step in to prevent this. This is like an element of even liberal states in the West, and certainly liberal states abroad.
Yeah, that's it. This is just an important point that I guess needs to be highlighted for a lot of people, because a lot of times religious-minded people or religious movements, they're painted as oh, they want to use force, or they're restrictive, or they're this and that, and but the reality is that any system, for it to basically maintain sort of in order for it to maintain its authenticity, is going to have to do that to a certain degree, and we don't find liberalism any different
Yeah.
than any other system. I think that's an important point.
Yeah, and it's really underlies, state control of these different educational projects, because schooling is one of the ways that certain norms, certain values are communicated, and throughout one of the themes that we find in Southeast Asia, as every other region, is states have utilized Islamic education. They have used state power to reshape Islamic education such that the form of Islam that is taught is a reformed version of Islam, which is progressively more in
Liberal.
keeping with liberal values, but generation after generation. So, actually, just because I'm worried about time, let me go
Yeah.
back to this slide presentation, and then maybe I can also mention some of the key events or some key facts that have relevance to some of these points that have been raised. So let me
Yeah.
just get this back up. Okay, so we're talking about Southeast Asia, and particularly the two very important Muslim countries of Indonesia and Malaysia. These countries fall under Dutch and British colonialism. And one of the things that the Dutch and the British colonial governments want to do in this region, in Southeast Asia region, as they've done in other regions, is they want to bring civilizational progress, and they want to reform indigenous religious traditions, whether it's Islam, whether it's Hinduism, whether it's Buddhism, such that these religious traditions are uh, more in keeping. They want to reinterpret them or rework them such that their doctrine, such that their teachings are closer to a scientific worldview and to a legitimation of human rights norms. So, what you have is you have the emergence of efforts to blend Islam and civilizational progress beginning in Southeast Asia in the early 19th century. Even though it really picks up in the later 19th and early 20th centuries, but one of actually the earliest people in the Muslim world who is involved in this process of creating a reformed version of Islam is a Southeast Asian individual. His name is Munshi Abdullah. He lived 1796 to 1854. He lives in Malacca, and he is an employee of the British colonial government. So he's a kind of a Muslim intellectual in certain ways, similar to Syed Ahmed Khan, although lives before Syed Ahmed Khan. And what he does is he encourages Muslims to learn English, get a Western education, learn modern Western forms of knowledge, and to reinterpret certain Islamic doctrines as more consistent uh, with the notion of civilizational progress. And one of the things that he also does is he preaches loyalty to the British in a way very similar to Syed Ahmed Khan. However, even though this is kind of like he's a very early figure, the real movement, kind of the popularization or popular religious movements that promote a kind of blending of civilizational progress with indigenous Islamic norms. This really happens in the late 19th to the early 20th century. In a Malaysian context, this movement is often referred to as the kaum muda, or kind of a young people's movement. And in Indonesia, this type of idea of blending Islam and Western conceptions of modernity is associated with particular mass organizations, the most important of which is known as Muhammadiyah. So, if we're talking about important figures, religious scholars, religious thinkers that are involved in promoting this blending of civilizational progress and Islam in a Southeast Asian context, after Munshi Abdullah, some of the most important figures would be Syed Sheikh Al Hadi, who's like a pro British Malay, Ahmed Dahlan, who is an Indonesian and forms the mass organization Muhammadiyah. Another is Tahir Jalaluddin. There's Haji Rasul, and so on. So these are all figures that are living kind of late 19th or early 20th century. Um, these developments happen in Southeast Asia slightly later than the Arab world and Egypt. So in Egypt, you're getting these efforts by people like Muhammad Abdu and Rashid Rida. Late 19th century, they are pretty developed in terms of blending together Islamic norms and Western norms of civilizational progress, and kind of Al-Azhar is the center of these developments. And as I mentioned earlier, for centuries, you have a situation where people from Southeast Asia have gone to Mecca and Al-Azhar for education. So in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they're still sending students to places like to Al-Azhar, and at Al-Azhar they are getting exposed to the kind of ideas that you have developed by Muhammad Abdu and Rashid Rida and Mustafa al-Maraghi, including this notion of wasatiyah. Wasatiyah being understood as a type of moderate Islam, a type of middle position that is in between kind of full acceptance of all aspects of Western modernity or complete repudiation of them in the name of preserving Islamic tradition. It's kind of a middle position. And you have this notion of wasatiyah also. People will speak about this movement in the Southeast Asian context. They also refer to it as wasatiyah, although they maybe change the spelling a little bit. What you find the kind of idea, the kind of version of Islam that these people have is the following. So they will accept the Quran as authentic. They will accept most hadith reports as authentic. But in terms of taqleed, in terms of, let's say, following the rules of the Shafi school, in terms of following, Asharite theology, they don't feel strictly bound by taqlid. And in fact, beyond the realm of aqidah and rituals and family law, they are open to changing different types of rules. So when it comes to commercial law, when it comes to criminal law, when it comes to the law of war, they, following the path of Al-Azhar, following the path of people like Muhammad Abdul Rashid Rida, Mustafa al-Maraghi, they think that these other areas are areas where there's room for flexibility, there's room for change, there's room for ijtihad. We don't need to stick to the literal meaning of these different Quranic or these different scriptural texts, Quran and Hadith, that say things like execute the apostate, or you're not allowed to do riba transactions. Those can be areas of ijtihad. They're also very critical of local customs, local syncretic customs, which don't have an Islamic basis. So let's say matrilineal inheritance, let's say Wayang, or Hindu shadow puppet shows. Let's say forms of dress like that don't involve the hijab. They would say, no, these are things that we reject. They also are critical of many Sufi practices that don't have a strong scriptural basis, or which appear to be superstitious. So, for instance, they would say that a type of religiosity that involves calling upon dead saints, dead awliya, and asking for their help is something that we should get rid of. Or they would say things like, let's say, going ahead and having a Mawlid celebration where you assume that the Prophet ﷺ is physically present and you kind of like stand up. This would be something that could be criticized. When we talk about these type of movements, this type of religiosity, as I mentioned earlier, in an Indonesian context, it is associated with specific mass organizations. So the most important mass organization it is associated with is known as Muhammadiyah, and that is established. Muhammadiyah is a organization. It's founded by Ahmed Dahlan, and this organization is established in 1912 in Yogyakarta. So kind of in the central Java region. And one of the things that Muhammadiyah is it is a institution that is concerned very heavily with schooling, but also social work. So Muhammadiyah begins establishing schools, and these schools are hybrid schools. We're not talking about universities at this point. We're talking about maybe primary and secondary schools. And what these schools do is, on the one hand, they teach traditional Arabic Islamic subjects, but on the other hand, they incorporate Western forms of learning as well. So there's an openness to, Western subjects, to the learning of different Western languages, like, let's say, Dutch, that is taught at these Muhammadiyah schools. And then in addition, they're running these social programs as well. So they're opening up clinics and orphanages and poorhouses. And then they're also opening up mosques as well. And of course, at these mosques, they are preaching this this type of reformed Islam that resembles what you find at Al-Azhar. And in fact, Muhammadiyah exists to this day. So in Indonesia right now, Indonesian religious life is dominated by two mass organizations, each of which has millions or maybe even tens of millions of members. One is Muhammadiyah, and one is Nahdlatul Ulama. Okay, so um, hmm. If we talk about Malaysia, Malaysia is a country that started establishing Islamic higher institutions of Islamic education in the 1950s. And these programs were very much influenced by Al Azhar. So the first one that they tried to establish, or the first one they established, is they established a institution called College Islam Malaya in 1955, but it was a short-lived project. It only lasted from 1955 to 1967. Remember, so once again, let me remind you that before this, you don't have higher institutions of Islamic education in Malaysia. People from the Malays who want higher levels of Islamic education. So yeah, they can get basic education in a local Malaysian context. But if they want higher education, they have to go abroad. They have to go to some place like Mecca. They have to go to some place like Al Azhar. But by the 1950s, the Malaysian government is establishing its own indigenous institutions of higher learning. So the first project of this type is College Islam Malaya. It is established in 1955, but closes its doors in 1967. And then for some period of time, there is no higher level institution of Islamic learning, or to the extent that you have it, it is basically you have a center or a department of higher Islamic studies, or an institute of higher Islamic studies, that is not like a separate Islamic institution or a separate Islamic university. Rather, it is simply part of a larger Western style university. So the most important, oldest Western style university that you have in Malaysia, it's called University Malaya. And after they shut down the College Islam Malaya, people who want to teach, people who want to study Islam at an advanced level, they go and they study at a center or a department in University of Malaya. But then the Malaysian government takes a new, they make new efforts to establish an institution of higher, they make new efforts to establish Islamic institution of higher education. And really the most important event happens in 1983, and that is when they establish International Islamic University Malaysia, University Islam Antarabangsa Malaysia. And this university will incorporate another kind of a think tank / research institute, which is known as ISTAC, or International Institute of Islamic Thought and Civilization. This is also established in the 1980s, but it becomes part of International Islamic University. And all of this is coordinated by a international institution known as the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. So the Organization of Islamic Cooperation it's like a Muslim UN. It continues to exist today. It's kind of an institution meant to foster cooperation between Muslim nations. It has had kind of a limited impact on the world. To the extent that it has had an impact, one of its most successful projects has been establishing international Islamic universities. So it's established these in a number of different places, including Bangladesh, including Niger, including Uganda. But the two most famous Islamic universities that it established, these were established in the 1980s. One is International Islamic University in Islamabad in Pakistan, and then the other one is this International Islamic University in Malaysia. So what is the type of ideology that they have there? I mean, it's close to like Azharite type Islam, where basically you're saying, okay, we're going to have some kind of hybrid understanding where we want to mix Islamic tradition and modernity. And, no, we're not going to, fundamentally change Aqidah beliefs. We're not going to say things like angels don't really exist, that they're a metaphor, or that heaven and hell are a metaphor. So we're going to stick to, basic Aqidah points. We're not going to change the religious rituals. We're going to stick, generally speaking, to most of the family law. But maybe beyond that, there is a realm of ijtihad. And we basically believe that we are not bound by taqleed. So we respect the traditional legal schools. We respect the Shafi school that has spread in this region, but we're not technically bound to accept Shafi opinions. So maybe according to the Shafi school, you can't marry without a wali, or your marriage to a wali doesn't function if that wali is a fasiq. But we don't need to be bound by taqlid. Maybe we can follow the Hanafi school, which is more lenient in those regards. So we can, just as in towards the middle of the 20th century, you get the development of the first Islamic universities in a Malaysian context. You have the same developments in Indonesia. So in the mid 20th century, you have the first efforts to establish Indonesian Islamic universities. So in 1945, there were a number of leading political figures, and they established a institution that is known today as Universitas Islam Indonesia. So Indonesian Islamic University. By the way, this is not the one that I teach at. So this is a private institution. It's called Indonesian Islamic University, but I'm at International Indonesian Islamic University. It's just an international thing that is a little bit different. But this is actually, even though there are a number of leading political figures that establish Indonesian Islamic University, this is a private institution, and it does not become Indonesia's most important institution of Islamic higher learning, partially because it doesn't have direct support from the state. The most important Islamic universities in Indonesia, at least before my university. So my university was established, started running maybe about 5 years ago. So you put that to the side, put aside, International Islamic University. Up until now, the most important Islamic universities there is a system of state-run Islamic universities. So these are known as Universitas Islam Negeri. So these are state-run Islamic universities. There is a network. There are dozens of these universities. They have branches all throughout the country. I mean, the best way to think of them is just, lots of different, they're semi-autonomous, but there are branches of them throughout the country. Every major city has one of these. The two most important state-run Islamic universities are, one is in Jakarta, and it is known as Sharif Hidayatullah, and then the other one is in Yogyakarta, and it's known as Sunan Kalijaga. So basically, these Islamic universities were established since the 1960s. The one in Jakarta and Yogyakarta are the most important. If you look at their structure is like that of other Islamic universities. So what do they have? They have a number of different faculties. Some of these faculties focus on Islam. So you have a faculty of Sharia. You have a faculty of Usul ad-Din. Then you also have other faculties that focus on modern Western forms of knowledge, like economics and business, or psychology, or medicine and health sciences. But what separates these Islamic universities is simply that they have a wider range of Islamic course offerings in their Islamic faculties, that to some extent they mix together the Western forms of knowledge and the traditional Islamic forms of knowledge. So, for instance, if you have you have a communications faculty, but one of the things that they teach in the faculty is how to do da'wah. You have an economics faculty, but one of the topics that they address is Islamic economics. You have a psychology faculty, but one of the things that they integrate is Islamic concepts of Sufism and, spiritual purification and mental health. And then in addition to offering more Islamic courses, there's like Islamic, as at other Islamic universities, there's kind of like an Islamic moral code in the sense, there's a big mosque in the middle of the university, and then people have an Islamic dress code. And, obviously, if you want to drink alcohol, or go to a club, it's not the best place to go. Those kind of things are, not allowed. Whereas at other kind of Western style state universities, secular universities, you would have that kind of behavior allowed. So, in terms of the ideology that you find at the form of religiosity that you find at these universities, it's very similar to Al Azhar in many ways, because you have prior to up until the 1970s, you have Indonesia, the people who taught at these universities were basically educated in the Middle East, especially at Al Azhar. So their understanding of Islam is like a Muhammad Abdul Rashid Ridda, Mustafa al Maraghi type understanding of Islam. And in fact, one of the people who is considered the founder of the current system of higher Islamic education in Indonesia. His name is Harun Nasution. He lived 1919 to 1998. He studied for a period at Al Azhar. He wrote a dissertation on Muhammad Abdu, and he considered himself, or he portrayed himself as one of Abdu's followers. And indeed, if we talk about Sharif Hidayatullah, once again, this is the most important state Islamic university in Indonesia and in Jakarta. They have a joint program with Al Azhar, where they will have, for instance, Azhar faculty teach at this university. On the other hand, there are some differences between the type of religion that is taught in an Egyptian context and in an Indonesian context. So, number one, if you talk about Islamic religiosity in Indonesia, it's much more, nationalism is a much more important point of emphasis. So, for instance, you are taught that there are courses. Indonesia has a nationalist ideology, which basically says that everyone in the Indonesian nation believes in one God, and there are kind of 6 recognized religions within Indonesia, and it's claimed that all of them share the same kind of understanding in one God. So Protestants, Catholics, Muslims, Buddhists, Confucians, and Hindus. All of them are understood as believing in one God and being kind of equal citizens of the Indonesian nation. And all of them. So this is a strong component. Respect for Indonesia's national ideology is a strong component. It's something which is very much emphasized at Indonesian religious universities. In fact, there are kind of all these Indonesian flags, and whenever you have like an event, whenever you have like a speaker or anything, you have to stand up and sing the Indonesian national anthem. So it's kind of a mixture of Indonesian nationalism and Islam. This is something that you find in some other countries. So, for instance, Turkish Islamic education has like a very strong element of Turkish nationalism. Although you have other countries like in Malaysia, in the Malaysian Islamic educational system, it's more like Egypt, where you don't have a strong nationalist component. Like, it's not part of the curriculum. It's not part of people's behavior. after the 1970s, so I said that before the 1970s, you have Indonesia's religious scholars educated at Al Azhar, and this makes them a little bit more conservative in certain ways. Because even though the Azhar scholars are reformist in a sense, their reformism is limited in certain ways. But after the 1970s, you have a situation where the Indonesian government says, okay, we need to have a type of Islam that is even more open and more progressive than what you find at Al Azhar. So Indonesian religious scholars, so the government has what is called the Ministry of Religious Affairs. That Ministry of Religious Affairs kind of makes decisions on who's going to get jobs at the religious universities, who's going to be able to teach at the mosques. What it does is it starts encouraging students and giving scholarships to students to study. Instead of studying at Al Azhar, it encourages them to study at Western universities. So one of the most important places where Indonesian students will study is University of Chicago. Another one is McGill in Canada. You also have people studying at Australia. And when they come to these institutions, when they start studying at these Western institutions, they become less like traditional Islamic scholars and increasingly more like Western academics. Um, and their own understanding of the Islamic tradition becomes somewhat more critical, and they're willing to kind of engage in certain types of more radical criticism of the Islamic tradition. Let's say, for instance, in dismissing hadith, dismissing various hadith as fabricated. And beyond that, you have a openness to religious reform. So, to give you some examples, uh, if you are talking about Azhar scholars today, Azhar scholars today, you ask them about something like, can we make ijtihad and get rid of the apostasy punishment? They will say, okay. Um, but if you are going to ask them, should everyone be completely free to change their religion? Many of them would say no. If you were to ask them things like, do we have a situation where we could have a non-Muslim ruler? Maybe they would say no in an Egyptian context and yes in a Indonesian context. Do you believe in giving kind of equal rights to people who are maybe have a same-sex orientation? That's a discussion that scholars in an Indonesian context might be willing to have, less so in a in context of Al Azhar. In the context of Al Azhar, the notion that so these are some of the so you can say that overall, even though scholars at Al Azhar and scholars in Indonesia both say, okay, we need to come up with some mix of liberal Western modernity and the Islamic tradition, comparatively speaking, scholars in Indonesia are more open to certain types of reforms, bringing their understanding of Islam into greater conformity with liberal human rights norms than their counterparts in a place like Egypt. And that's especially true since the 1970s, where you've had a shift in where the teachers at these Islamic universities are educated. Okay.
I mean, but can you, I guess, can you like really say that on a blanket level? I mean, and at Al Azhar, you have like, every end of the spectrum, right? You have like very, very traditionally trained faculty. And that's the other thing. Like, are you referring to Al Azhar graduates? Are you referring to Al Azhar
Faculty.
faculty? Are you referring to Al Azhar? Okay. In the faculty, I mean, you'll find some like, ultra traditional, conservative, like Salafi types. You'll get people that sympathize with governments. You'll get people that are pro Khilafa. You'll get people that are Tablighi. You'll get like every end of the spectrum, right? You'll get your ultra, reformist types as well. So if it comes to the faculty itself, like, why don't you say that there's more of a variety and not really like I don't think that they would blanket give some of the answers like proposed
So to
perhaps.
some extent, that's certainly true, but to another extent, I would say that there are certain commonalities. So even when it comes to, let's say, at Al Azhar, could you be an Ikhwani Islamist at Al Azhar? I would say no. You're not going to be given any faculty position or any influential position, even outside of Al Azhar. You would face, problems. Um, uh, at Al Azhar, do you have certain at Al Azhar? Could you be a Salafi? Could you be like an open Salafi? I don't think that that's true. To the extent, uh, maybe there are a small number. So if you were to say, could you be a graduate of Al Azhar and be a Salafi? Yeah. So yeah, but you wouldn't be part of the official institution anymore. If you are a Salafi, uh, in like a Wahhabi Salafi type at Al Azhar, there's not much of a place for you, maybe marginal place at the lowest level, but there's a conscious decision not to teach that perspective on Islam. Could you be a traditionalist at Al Azhar? It depends on what you mean as traditionalist. If you mean like Ali Juma, Osama Sayyid type traditionalist, these scholars are traditionalist in a very specific way. So let's take Ali Juma. Ali Juma is traditionalist in the sense that he says, oh, we teach the madhabs, we love, Asharite aqidah, we believe in following a Sufi tariqah. But if you ask him, and I've seen videos on this, if you ask him a question like, is Egyptian law consistent with the Sharia? And keep in mind, the Egyptian legal system we have today is modeled on, let's say, French law or some mixture of French law and American law. If you ask them, is it consistent with the Sharia? Someone like Ali Joma will say virtually, 90% or more is consistent with the Sharia, because he believes that these are that beyond the realm of ibadat and beyond the realm of family law, that this is an area of ijtihad. So if you want to say that Ali Juma is if you want to say that Ali Juma is a traditionalist scholar, I don't think he's traditionalist in the sense that he upholds the rulings of the pre-modern fiqh madhabs like Hanafi or Shafi or whatever. If you want to say that he's a traditionalist scholar in the sense, if by that you mean, he considers the rulings of the Shafi school as authoritative in the realm of ibadat or in the realm of certain aspects of family law, or does he support different Sufi practices like, let's say, tawassul or maulid? Yeah, I say he's traditional in that sense. But if someone like Ali Juma or Osama Sayyid or any of them said, "Oh, we need to have an Islamic government," this is they wouldn't be given high level positions because this is seen as inconsistent with the state ideology. That's not unique to Egypt. That's true in other places as well. I mean, you can say that there are some Azhar scholars, like I believe there's one figure named Ahmed Karima, who's saying some stuff which is maybe even Christians can enter into heaven and some stuff like that. I tend, from my understanding, this is like atypical belief. But this kind of stuff that Ahmed Karima says is more common in Indonesian. Like maybe in an Azhar context, this is like a kind of a very provocative, very much a provocative minority view. But in an Indonesian context, there's a comparatively speaking more openness to that. Does that make any sense? So yeah, I think that you're right to say that there is diversity in Indonesia and in Egypt. But in terms of openness to liberal norms, I would say that there's more openness to reform in the name of liberal norms in a Indonesian context, and that is tied to structural changes. So it is tied to before the 1970s to creating hybrid educational institutions where you have kind of a mixture of Islamic faculties and then faculties that teach Western forms of knowledge. And it's also tied to, since the 1970s, making a conscious decision to have your religious scholars or your leading religious scholars educated at Western universities. And by the way, this isn't something that they're ashamed of. This isn't something like, this isn't some like scandal that they're ashamed of. They intentionally say that since after the 1970s, you have a movement called the Pembaharuan movement, called the Renewal Movement. And it is associated with figures like Nurcholis Majid or Azumardi Azra. They say intentionally, we are going beyond the type of religious ideology or the form of religion that is taught at Al Azhar. We're more progressive than they are. We are more open to gender egalitarianism than they are. We are more open to religious freedom than for non-Muslims than they are. We are more open to democracy or secularism than they are. So this is not something that they would be embarrassed to hear. They're quite proud. So I mean, I don't say this to commend them or to criticize them, but it is an asset. Like if you're comparing Islam in Indonesia to Islam in Egypt, this is what you would find. On the other hand, I also don't want to generalize and say this is true of all Southeast Asian Islam. So one surprising thing is you look at a Malaysian and you look at an Indonesian, and basically they're speaking dialects of the same language. They look very similar from the outside, but this is not true of Malaysian education. Malaysian education is, comparatively speaking, much closer to Al Azhar, and in that sense, much more conservative than you find in Indonesia. And that's because of certain decisions that were made by the government and the administration in terms of how to structure the system of religious education.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess one question, like a burning question that I have within myself, is that there is a kind of succession that we see from, let's say, the 1970s, right? For a kind of like modernist scripturalism um, in Indonesia, and then we see it all the way until today. And we're not talking really about a colonial era anymore, right? Like, so what are the factors that are, let's say, shaping this trajectory, this educational or
Well, in
epistemological
an Indonesian
trajectory?
context, there are multiple factors. So there is an indigenous factor. There are many Indonesians, especially elite Indonesians, that are favorable to the project of development or civilizational progress, who have a great deal of respect for a scientific worldview and liberal human rights norms. And they have been actors, they have exercised their agency. To go ahead and promote these changes. So part of it is internal, just like you've had people like this in Egypt or Persia or Iran or Turkey. You do have these populations, especially among elites in literally every Muslim country, every non Muslim country. You have a more liberal faction. You also have a more conservative faction as well that is resisting this. One reason why the liberal faction, I think, is more successful in an Indonesian context is partially because of Indonesia's increasingly strong ties to the United States. One of the individuals who was important in making certain changes in Indonesia after the 1970s was a U.S. ambassador to Indonesia, who was Paul Wolfowitz. So Paul Wolfowitz, before he became famous for this notion of regime change in Iraq and reforming religion and culture and political institutions in the Middle East. Before this, he was ambassador to Indonesia, and he wanted to promote reform. So, in terms of offering aid, in terms of offering scholarships, in terms of offering financial incentives to the Indonesian state, Paul Wolfowitz was Paul Wolfowitz uh, offered these incentives, and that kind of, in terms of the um, ongoing debates between maybe the more liberal progressive factions and the more conservative factions. U.S. intervention through Paul Wolfowitz and others did intentionally promote the more liberal progressive factions. That's not something unique to Indonesia. That's literally U.S. policy in many Muslim countries, whether we're talking about Egypt, whether we're talking about Pakistan or whatever. I would say that in Indonesia it has been more impactful than, let's say, in Malaysia or in some other Muslim countries. So,
Okay, so I'm wondering at this point, shall we pause here and continue with the South Asian region in the
yeah,
next
I can
question?
continue a little bit further. I mean, you do have these. So you do have these figures who are teaching at the religious universities. They are arguing for Indonesia as being a hub, as being a leader in progressive liberal form, or more progressive, more liberal forms of Islam that are marked by kind of a greater openness to liberal human rights norms. So in that sense, they're endorsing a type of reform that has an Azharite genealogy, but in a sense goes further and embracing a human rights norm since the 1970s. So this happens at this project is a project associated with these state Islamic universities, but it also comes to be embraced by the two mass organizations that are found in Indonesia. Recall that in the early 20th century, you have the mass organization Muhammadiyah, which has kind of an Azharite ideology, but it's a private mass organization, and they run a system of schools. And later on, they will run a system of universities as well. So today, in addition to these state Islamic universities, there are Muhammadiyah universities. And Muhammadiyah has become progressively more open to more liberal forms of Islam after the 1970s, after the 1990s. A key figure in this process has been a major religious scholar named Ahmed Shafi Ma'arif. He lived 1935 to 2022, and he acquired his doctorate from University of Chicago. So in fact, if we talk about two of the very important figures in liberalizing Indonesian Islam, one of them is Nurcholis Majid, who got his doctorate at University of Chicago under Fazlur Rahman, and then another is Ahmed Shafi Ma'arif. Interestingly enough, we'll soon talk about who is probably the most influential person over maybe the last 50 years in Indonesian Islam. His name is Abdurrahman Wahid. He also gets involved in this liberalization movement as well. Although I would say that this is what you one of the things that is a little bit confusing to people is you can be open to liberal human rights norms and be considered more of a modernist, and you can do it and be considered more of a traditionalist. So if you come from a more modernist background, like Muhammadiyah, maybe you adopt democracy, you adopt gender egalitarianism, but you are modernist in the sense that you don't believe in taqleed of the madhabs when it comes to ibadat, when it comes to forms of worship. You don't, for instance, celebrate Maulid. You don't believe in doing tawassul or istighatha to saints. That is kind of what separates you. That's what makes you a modernist. Whereas if you're a traditionalist, more traditionally oriented, you can still adopt um, you can still adopt uh, gender egalitarianism and secularism and democracy and religious liberty. But what makes you a traditionalist is not what makes you a traditionalist in an Indonesian context, and indeed in other contexts, is in a sense is just that you're a traditionalist in the realm of worship and aqidah and certain aspects of family law. It doesn't mean that you want to hold up traditional Islamic norms of Sharia and Khilafah. If we want to talk about an American context, a helpful example is, let's say, Abdullah bin Bayah or Hamza Yusuf. Abdullah bin Bayah and Hamza Yusuf, if you talk about the realm of aqidah, if you talk about the realm of religious rituals, okay, yeah, they're going to be open to tawassul and maulid and tabarruk and all this other kind of stuff. However, when it comes to, let's say, Sharia and Khilafah, then they would oppose it, despite the fact they come from a traditionalist background. Then you can talk about someone who comes from, let's say, Ikhwani type background, maybe a type, I don't know, like maybe a Yusuf al-Qaradawi type background. He is going to come from a more Ikhwani type background, but might adopt some of the same liberal reformist views. You can also talk about someone who comes from maybe like a Salafi background, like a Yasir Qadi type. So Yasir Qadi, maybe he's not going to be doing istighatha. Maybe he's not going to be celebrating Maulids. But in terms of his views on democracy and secularism, they might be very similar. So you can come from different backgrounds and ultimately make these same liberal reforms. In many Muslim countries today, what differentiates a modernist from a traditionalist is simply, it doesn't concern, when someone says I'm a modernist or a traditionalist, doesn't really tell you much about their views on Khilafah and Sharia. Modernist versus traditionalist more focuses on certain issues that have to do with the aqidah and ibadat and family law, because this is the only type of religion that persists after modernization. So they're traditionalist or modernist in that domain, but outside of that domain, many people are full modernists. But I should mention the other mass organization that you find in an Indonesian context is known as Nahdlatul Ulama. So in the 1920s, just as you have the kind of Azhar reformist mass organization in Indonesia is Muhammadiyah, the more traditionalist orientation that is, more pro-Sufi, Maulid, Tawassul, Tabarruk, these kind of things, that is associated with a kind of a rural area. This is known as Muhammadiyah. This is known as Nahdlatul Ulama. And their idea is we want to preserve the form of Islam, the somewhat syncretic form of Islam that was brought by the 9 saints, that was brought by the Wali Songo. The founder of this traditionalist mass organization is known as Hashim Ash'ari. He lived 1875 to 1947. They actually run a number of Islamic universities as well. So they run their most important Islamic universities are located in the city of Jakarta, Yogyakarta, and Surabaya. And their most important figure is Abdurrahman Wahid, who lives 1940 to 2009. And this is a person who identifies as a traditionalist in the sense that he's a pro-Sufi, pro-tradition, pro-taqlid in a certain way, but he's traditionalist in the same sense that, let's say, an Ali Juma or an Abdullah bin Baya is traditionalist, meaning that at the same time, he is open to outside of the realm of ibadat, outside of the realm of aqidah, he's open to adopting lots of liberal human rights norms and seeing those as the appropriate norms to follow in our era. So Abdurrahman Wahid is a very, if you were going to talk about kind of the most influential or important Southeast Asian religious figure, it would probably be Abdurrahman Wahid. He lives 1940 to 2009. One of the reasons why he's such an important figure is he actually also became president of Indonesia for a period of time. So he was president of the entire country. One of the reasons why Indonesians agreed to electing him as president is precisely because so he won the support of kind of religiously oriented Indonesians because he is like a traditionalist religious scholar. On the other hand, he won the support of maybe Indonesians who were proponents of kind of liberal human rights norms, precisely because the version of Islam that he promoted was a mixture of them both. Overall, when we talk about the forms of the types of religious universities that we find in a Indonesian context, they're the state Islamic universities, like Win Sharif Hidayatullah, like Sunan Kalijaga. They resemble in structure like Al Azhar, except they are more liberal and progressive. Then you have a smaller network of religious universities that is operated by the mass organizations Muhammadiyya and Nahdlatul Ulama. These Muhammadiyya is called modernist, oftentimes called modernist. Nahdlatul Ulama is called traditionalist, but in terms of their difference is more on matters of aqidah and ibadat, but in terms of their overall orientation towards the secular, towards liberal human rights norms, they, especially since the 1970s, since the 1990s, there's been kind of a convergence towards adopting kind of more progressive or liberal forms of Islam. And I should also say that these organizations are only Indonesia has, even though these are private organizations, in the 1980s, they were required to formally adopt a particular position. The Indonesian government made a law that said if you want to operate a mass organization in Indonesia, where you have your charities or you have your schools or you have your universities, you're obliged to endorse the state ideology, the state nationalist ideology of Pancasila. And that ideology, among other things, so it says all Indonesians are monotheists. The six religions of Indonesia are all acceptable because they're all monotheism. They're all monotheistic. And also the ideology of Pancasila says because all the members of the six religions in Indonesia are equal, there cannot be the imposition of religious law. So there cannot be a khilafah. There could not be implementation of Sharia, at least beyond Sharia courts, Sharia family courts for Muslims, which do exist. So both Muhammadiyya and Nahdlatul Ulama did adopt this. So after this law was passed, both of them said, okay, yeah, we don't believe that Khilafah and Sharia are appropriate to an Indonesian context. To the extent that Islam is practiced in an Indonesian context, it has to be limited to Aqidah and Ibadat and the family law system, family law courts. So those are some things. I should say that there are there people in Indonesia who are there people in Indonesia who kind of resist these moves or these developments? Yes. So, for instance, within Nahdatul Ulama, there are figures who rejected the kind of liberalization that you find since the 1970s, the 1990s. Two influential figures would be Maymun Zubair and Buya Yahya. But kind of the most famous person who rejects these developments is a figure. He comes from a traditionalist background in the sense that he comes from like a Hadrami Sufi Indonesian background, but he also is traditionalist in the sense of favoring some kind of Sharia application. So his name is Habib Rizq. He was born in 1965. He's still alive to this day. He formed an organization in 1998 called Front Pembela Islam, which is in Jakarta, but with branches elsewhere, which is kind of Islamic Defense Front. And basically, the point of this organization was to encourage Muslims to live in keeping with Islamic norms and to encourage the eventual implementation of Sharia. And he also would do things like, you know, if they saw people operating food stalls in Ramadan, they would shut them down. If they saw brothels, houses of prostitution, they would go and shut them down. And then they would have demonstrations which would talk about the importance of, let's say, punishing people who engaged in blasphemous statements. But this particular group was shut down. So this organization that he ran, which is Front Pembela Islam, this was shut down in 2020 on charges of kind of radicalism or fanaticism. So this would be another example of how state power is exerted. So yes, so the state can do things like work for the liberalization of religious discourse by having religious scholars educated in the US and Canada and Europe and the West since the 1970s, and encourage a greater openness to human rights in that way. And then they can also counter figures who are pushing in the opposite direction by Habib Rizq by saying, okay, well, this organization you have and the pesantrens and the religious schools and the charities and the forms of activism that are associated with it, we don't have room for that. We don't want to encourage that. And in fact, we are going to dissolve this organization. So this is something that this is an important aspect of religious life in an Indonesian context. You can also have some kind of literalist, scripturalist figures that maybe resemble Salafis to an extent. You have the emergence of these figures in the early 20th century. Two of the most important figures are Ahmed Hassan, who lives 1887 to 1958, and Munawwar Khalil, who lives 1908 to 1961. Both of them are critical of Sufism and, forms of religiosity that center on dead saints or certain types of religiosity associated with the Mawlid of the Prophet ﷺ, where people stand up on the assumption the Prophet ﷺ is somehow supernaturally present. Both of them encourage, following, rejecting taqlid, following scripture, following the literal meaning of the Quran and the Hadith. And they established an institution called Persatuan Islam in 1923 in Bandung, which is one of the major cities in Java. But ultimately, and they try and establish in 1936 they established an institute of higher level Islamic studies, which incorporates some Western subjects. And this organization is still, Persatwa in Islam is still found today. It's just not very influential. In fact, to the extent that you have a influential institution of kind of higher Salafi religious learning, Salafi type kind of anti-taqlid, literal scripturalism. The most important institution was established in 1980 by Saudi Arabia. It's basically a branch of Imam Muhammad ibn Saud Islamic University in Riyadh. So in Saudi Arabia, there are three very famous religious universities. One is Medina University, one is Al-Qura, and one is Muhammad ibn Saud. So Medina University is in Medina, Al-Qura is in Mecca, Muhammad ibn Saud is in Riyadh. Riyadh is also like this, it's in Najd. It's in central Saudi Arabia, Central Arabia. So it's like the core area of the Wahhabi Dawah, the traditional Wahhabi Dawah. So they have a branch of this. They developed a branch of this in the 1980s in Jakarta. It is called the Institute. It's called Lembaga Ilmu Pengetahuan Islam dan Arab. So the Institute for Islamic and Arabic knowledge. So this kind of became the most important institution of Salafi type religious education, higher level Salafi type religious education in an Indonesian context. But the Indonesian government didn't want this spreading too much, so you don't get a lot of institutions of this type. And moreover, given Saudi Arabia's own shifts in religious policies over the past decade or so, the Saudi government isn't trying to propagate this form of Salafi, kind of Salafi Wahhabi Islam in a Indonesian context. Indeed, if we talk about Salafism in a Southeast Asian context, Salafism has been much less impactful socially, and in terms of universities, it's been much less impactful in a Southeast Asian context than it has been in an Arab context, than it has been in the It's been very influential in the Arab context, very influential in the sub-Saharan African context. Maybe you could even say somewhat influential by combining with Ahlul Hadith in a South Asian context, but in a Southeast Asian context, it's more marginal, and that's especially true in Indonesia, partially because of influence from the government, which has tried to prevent it from spreading. So, yeah, you do have. So that's kind of like an introduction to Islam in Southeast Asia. Maybe we don't have too much time to get into China to discuss developments in China. It would require some background to how Islam enters into China over the Silk Road, through the Indian Ocean, and also about the policies of the Chinese Communist Party, the religious policies of the Chinese Communist Party, and also the Chinese Muslim population, which is a little bit difficult to understand because you have some Muslims who live in northwestern China. They're basically Turkic Muslims in terms of language and ethnicity. Then you have other Muslims who resemble the Han Chinese, called Hui Muslims, who are scattered throughout other regions of China. And it would take a lot of background information to kind of lay all of that out there before we can talk about Chinese Muslim educational institutions, which on a global level are comparatively speaking peripheral. And since we're already over 2 hours, that might not be the best. That would take like at least another hour to go through.
Honestly, the subject that you discuss is so unique that personally, myself, I could continue just listening to you.
We're
Education
very kind.
itself. I mean, I know, outside of me being kind or not, just education itself is basically, my fundamental belief is there's a reason why Islam as a religion is an intellectual religion, and that's something that a lot of times, often it's overlooked. Just the push that exists right? The exhortation that exists in Islam to learn, right? And even if you look at part of the civilizational miracle of the Prophet ﷺ is actually that he took a nation that, were actually completely not used to learning, and like intellectualism might have completely not been their thing. And the Prophet ﷺ pushes them to learn until they become curious about literally everything, and they create intellectual centers, even in sciences that already existed but or perhaps not codified. All codification pretty much happens after the Prophet ﷺ, and a lot of times we miss that aspect of education. And personally, I believe that education is really the key to shaping identity. And as you pointed out, colonization is very interested in civilization, and creating the notion of the subject and creating identity, shaping identity. And sometimes we miss the effect of education on that. And I think what you're doing is extremely unique. Like it hasn't really been put together uh, at all in one place, in the online sphere. So, we're very grateful to you for that. And
Very kind.
yeah, and definitely, I think we should have an entire session actually just for China before we actually get into South Asia. And we'd love to hear from your expertise. And I'll, as usual, I'll interject with my curiosity and my critique. Um,
Okay, well, I look forward to it. And kind of one point that I do find interesting and is relevant to a point that you raised is one feature that you get, which is a little bit unique about Islamic civilization, is in terms of openness to forms of so I have to say this myself, so this is my own bias, it could be wrong. I actually don't believe that the Islamic religion itself necessarily is open to other perspectives. I'm not saying it is, I'm not saying it isn't, I just have a neutral position. I'm not sure which is the true, but historically it is true. Historically it is true that Muslims, in terms of the historical experience, have been remarkably open to integrating other forms of knowledge before the modern period. So if you look at, for instance, the knowledge, the structure of knowledge and learning, and in a Hindu-Indian context, they're actually very closed off. So they're not kind of like taking in forms of knowledge from Greece and Persia and China. Also, China is, comparatively speaking, closed off. One of the things which is a little bit unique about Islamic civilization, beginning with, especially with the Abbasids and the translation movement, is how very much, and this isn't something that can be taken for granted, but it is how open they are to trying to integrate knowledge from these different parts of the world, from these different civilizations, Greek, Persian, Indian, Chinese. So that's kind of like a unique aspect of Islamic civilization. So
yeah, Jazakallah khair for that comment.
yeah.
So having said that, I think we'll close off the episode. Jazakumullah khair for all the time that you've given us. Jazakumullah khair to all the viewers as well. Please do not forget to like and subscribe, and inshallah we'll see you next time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.